Good day, everyone, and welcome to, I've heard in other conferences, what's called the siesta slot, which is right after lunch. Hopefully, even though it's not a technical session, it's all about the NIS2 Directive and whatnot, I can still manage to somewhat keep you entertained for the next hour or so. So as you've seen, and I'm assuming you're in the right room, this is the session about NIS2 and CRA. How many of the people in the room know what NIS stands for? 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. How many have kind of an idea of the NIS and NIS2 directive and the whole thing behind it? So that's about a third. All right, so then the others are definitely in the right room if you want to find out more. Is anyone here that works for an entity, a company that is right now affected by the NIS directive? All right, that's 3, 4, 5 hands. How many of you know if you're going to be affected by NIS2? Okay. So to keep things moving, a little bit about me. My background's in IT infrastructure, security, cloud. I've been doing that for a little over 20 years. I'm the co-founder of a company called E3 Cyber. We mostly do virtual CISO services, so we help companies with their cybersecurity strategy, governance, risk management, and so on. I've also become recently involved in a security conference that we organized back in Transylvania, if you want to find out more about that. I've been doing another conference for a little over 10 years called IT Camp there. So I'm based in Romania, in Transylvania. That's easier for most people, because many people can't even place Romania on the map. If you say Transylvania, at least people have heard of that, right? So that's where I live. But enough about me. Let's go through the first part of today's talk, which is the NIS directive. And for that, we'll try to go through a little bit of history and see where we stand right now and how NIS came to be and what the problems with the current implementation of it are and why NIS2 came along. And then we'll dive deeper into some of the details on what it covers, what organizations are impacted, and so on. So if we are to look at NIS, right now that's what's in effect, right? So this is a directive. Who here knows the difference between a directive and a regulation at the EU level? 5, 6 hands. All right, so a regulation, like GDPR, you've heard of GDPR, right? That, whenever it's passed as law, it goes into effect in all the state members of the EU, automatically. A directive, on the other hand, whenever it's passed in the Council, Parliament, whatever, whenever it's voted in, the member states individually need to implement legislature to cover the directive. So in some cases, that piece of law which goes into each member state might differ from another member state. The directive might tell you where you've got some leeway, some flexibility on how to implement it, and each member state will decide how far they want to go with that. So there are certain things that need to be everywhere, but there's others that are at the freedom of the member states in how they implement them, and so on and so forth. And this is what happened with NIS1. So its original goal was to try to achieve a common level of cybersecurity throughout the European Union, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure and digital service providers and whatnot, right? And trying to ensure that the EU as a whole and organizations within the EU do cybersecurity better. Not right, but at least better. And they do so in a consistent manner across the entirety of the EU. Now, the issue with that was, and there were a number of issues. One, we saw significant gaps in the way the member states transposed the directive into national law. They went for the easiest way out. Like, if we don't really have to do X, we won't. And that's what got a few of the member states with a more strict NIS implementation and others with kind of a more lenient one. There were no clear guidelines on the sanctions. So in a lot of cases, the nation states decided, well, you need to do this. But if you don't, we'll give you a slap on the wrist. We'll tell you, nah, you're a bad boy. You didn't do your job. That's it. Which, as you may know, in some cases is not enough for an organization, especially large organization, to do something about it. This is how GDPR was different, if you will, because it had those huge fines. And everyone, instead of doing the right thing for the right thing, they did it to avoid huge fines. Right? So that wasn't in NIS originally. Now, ransomware has grown a lot, especially over the years of the pandemic. We saw a lot of critical infrastructures being targeted more and more by hacktivists and cyber criminals. And as time passed, member states started seeing the, if you will, the gaps into what NIS was supposed to have done and to what it ended up doing. So that's when the discussions about, hey, let's do an update on this thing came along. And that happened back in 2020. Discussions started going on, and they said, well, we need to do a couple of things. Well, three things, like strengthen and harmonize the capacity of the member state, the cybersecurity capacity of the member states, try to do a better job at protecting the critical economic and societal activities, because it seems like NIS1 wasn't covering enough of that. So they basically extended the sectors that it covers, and we'll go into details in a minute. And trying to establish kind of a cooperation system. Because if one member state sees an attack, you would want the others to be aware of it and to start implementing measures of protections against that. So like, just talk to each other kind of a thing, which wasn't happening before, or not at the level at which NIS2 tries to do it. So what's NIS2 then? Well, this is, again, another directive. It was introduced in 2020, and it came into effect a little under a year ago. So January of 2023, it came into effect. So it was voted in. It's in effect, but it's not applicable, it's not mandatory until, and you might have noticed the little counter in the bottom right, until later this year. It's October 17th of this year when all member states need to have this transposed into national law and need to figure out how they do it. Now, most member states already have NIS1 done to a certain extent. Some member states delayed that by months or like up to a year after the mandatory time period, because, you know, like, we can push it a little bit, so we'll push it a little bit. The thing is, you've already got the foundation for that. So NIS2 should just be an update to what's already there. So the assumption is the implementation will go a lot faster. Now, for those of you who've been in the session right before lunch in this room, there was a discussion about the efficiency of stuff being put into law in a year where you've got a lot of elections. There's a lot of elections going on all over the world. Even back home in Romania, we've got an election year. So I highly doubt a lot of stuff will be put in by the current government, because it's going to be like, it's a problem for the guys that get voted in, right? So once that happens in October of this year, all the stuff that we're going to be talking about will become mandatory, right? And like I mentioned, there's some changes from NIS. One is they broaden the scope. So now there's more sectors, more organizations that are affected. Two, they implemented and they established EU Cyclone, which is the Cyber Crisis Liaison Organization Network, which is that body that ensures communication between member states on any sort of incidents and reports and looks at how these new measures actually help and tries to see whether some other changes might be needed in the future. It does come with a set of stricter requirements. So it's a lot clearer now where risk management comes into play. There's a clear list of what organizations need to do. It's not like do security better, like NIS1 kind of told organizations to do. The list is a lot clearer, a lot more extensive, and we'll see what that is. And also ensuring business continuity falls under the requirements, right? And fourth, so last but not least, the repercussions, the fines are there, and they're way higher, so they're at kind of the level of what GDPR brings. So now if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, you'll be fined. Like I mentioned, on this one, member states chose the sanctions. And some of them chose like really, really low sanctions. So even if you didn't do it, it could just be part of your budget this year. Like, we're not going to be compliant with X. We're going to have to pay a fine. It's all right. It's in the budget. We'll pay the fine. We'll move on. Unfortunately, that's how some organizations do business nowadays. So if there's anything that you might need to leave this room with, it's these points. Like, what does NIS do? NIS2, right? What does NIS2 bring along? One, the fines are higher. So right now, they go up to 10 million euros or 2% of your total annual turnover, whichever is highest, right? So it's again, similar to GDPR. They extended the scope, and now companies need to comply. A lot more companies need to comply with a lot more stuff, right? So that's the extended scope. A thing that's different, and it's different from other directives and regulations that the EU has put in so far, is that they want to find a way, and that's going to fall on the member states to figure out how that's going to be done when it gets transposed into law, but they want to find a way to make sure that senior management is liable for any infringements. So if you fail to meet the requirements, the person inside the organization who's responsible might be suspended. So his management position might be suspended until the stuff gets fixed. Also, the organization itself might have its permits and authorizations to perform a service. They might have that suspended as well until they comply. So this is somewhat different from just getting a fine. You will not be allowed to do whatever it is you're doing until you fix your stuff. Right? For the measures themselves, the security risk management measures are now in a clear, more extended list. Now, they're still vague, but they're not as vague as they used to be in NIS1. And it's a list that you have to be able to say, yes, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing that. And we'll see what that is in a moment. And 5, and this is also a change from NIS1, mandatory reporting. So now, if you run into what's called a serious security incident, you are now required to report that to the local body, the local authority within each member state that's supposed to handle this. Within 24 hours of discovering it, you need to tell them, hey, there's something bad that we've just become aware of. Within 72 hours, you're required to give an update. Like, we've investigated, we've taken a look, and we have this new information to provide as to what happened and how it happened and who did it and how they got in and things like that. And then 30 days after the incident, you are required to either provide a final report or an intermediary report if you haven't finished your investigation. And you are also required to provide any sort of intermediary reports at the request of the local authority at any time. So they can come in and ask you for an update at any time until those 30 days are over, or even after those 30 days are over, if you haven't figured out and resolved the incident by then. But this, put together with the fact that now these local government bodies that are meant to communicate to each other, they are now more aware of critical incidents happening in each member state, and they also talk to each other and they send that information over, say, hey, and again, who here has been in the talk right before lunch here? Okay, so there was a mention of the incident in Denmark of last year, if you recall, with the power companies there being all attacked at the same time and so on and so forth. So such an incident will, under NIS2, one, be reported and transmitted to all the other member states so that maybe other organizations in other countries know or find out about, hey, there's a new danger out there that's targeting this type of a device or this type, it's this type of an attack. Maybe you should know about it and help protect or prevent it better, right? So as far as the timeline goes, the proposal for NIS2 came in on December 2020. It was adopted by the Parliament in December of 2022. It came into force January of last year. This summer, so July of this year, is when EU Cyclone is supposed to provide its first report of like liaising with the other organizations across the member states. The deadline is on October 17th of this year. And then going forward, they're also supposed to monitor and see how these changes impact the member states and what sort of updates they might need to do up until 2027, when they might look at a revision of the directive and have kind of a NIS3 sort of a thing, right? So this is kind of the timeline that we're looking at right now. Now, when it comes to improvements and novelties, I've marked them on the slide. NIS1 had 30 types of entities that would have been covered or are covered, because that's in effect right now. NIS2 comes with 67, so that's fairly extended. They also include small and medium enterprises under certain conditions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They also include the supply chain. And just to give an example, one of those cases where an SME, even if you're a company with like 5 people, if you handle, say, the DNS infrastructure, DNS resolution for a number of domains within your country, you are part of a supply chain, and you having any sort of issue might affect a lot of other websites and a lot of companies, so you will fall under NIS2, even though you don't meet the number of employees, the revenue, or other criteria of matching that, like big organization or critical organization. So if you're part of a supply chain, even if you don't fall under the sectors that it covers, if you, for instance, provide services for a company that falls under NIS, then you need to also be compliant with the requirements of the directive. So that's a thing to keep in mind. As opposed to NIS1, any sort of audits done by authorities, they can be done voluntarily. They can just come in and ask for you to provide information instead of only being able to do so after an incident, like it's the case with NIS1 right now. The notifications, we'll talk about that in a minute. Supply chain compliance, I also mentioned risk management TOM, so technical and organizational measures that should cover multiple areas are now listed in the directive. There's sanctions, and we'll see the difference between essential and important sectors in a minute. Criminal sanctions against management, and suspension of certifications or pending authorizations for the organization itself. So that's also a new thing that they're kind of trying out with NIS2, alongside the temporary ban on management positions that I mentioned. Now, another thing here is how they extended the sectors. And you see a list here, and anything that's a plus has either been added or they had the thing expanded from NIS1. So it might have been in NIS1 and got expanded, or was just added in NIS2. And they divide the sectors into essential business sectors and important business sectors. The companies that fall under each might be different. The sanctions for each are different. But now it's a lot more organizations that would fall under this. So you see under energy, we did have, and we do have right now, electricity, gas, and oil, but NIS2 also extends that to hydrogen and district heating and cooling, right? Transportation was already included. Health, besides healthcare providers, which are hospitals and whatnot, now you've got the pharmaceutical industry that's also covered under NIS2. Space was added, wastewater was added, public administration was added, and even ICT service management, B2B. That falls, again, under essential. So it's not important. It's the one with the higher sanctions. The important business sectors, this is all new. So you only had essentials, right, under NIS1. This is where postal, courier services, waste management, digital providers, chemicals, food, research, and manufacturing come in, right? And they're all detailed, and whenever there's kind of a clear location where you can find out more, I've tried to put it on the slide, so you can find this in Annex 1 and 2. If you search for the directive, the text of the directive, you just go to Annex 1 and 2, and you find out more about the sectors. All right, so how do we figure out if we are impacted? Which organizations are the ones that are impacted? So they have certain criteria, which is one, the size of the entity, the number of employees, and they look either at the revenue or the balance sheet. And you don't need to have both of these match. So both over 250 employees and over 50 million euros in revenue. It's either or, and that puts you there. But if you notice, with the medium, and you would fall under important entities with that, but if you've got a revenue of over 10 million euros, you already fall under important entities, right? So that's enough to make you kind of fit into the requirements for NIS. And that's between 50 and 250 employees. So even if you've got less than 10 million euros in revenue, if you've got 50 employees, you're already one of the entities that, if affected by a significant incident, needs to report it and do all the stuff that NIS2 requires. And even micro and small, now, they should not be concerned in general, but there are some exceptions to the rule. And one of them, I've already mentioned, if you're in the supply chain, or if you're a qualified trust service provider or sole provider, that's also, so the concept of sole provider. If you're the only one providing a specific service in the market, even if you've got like one employee, you still fall under NIS because you're a sole provider of that service in the market. Now, each member state is required, and I might be wrong on this, but is required to provide the full list of entities by, I think, April of next year. So they've got like 6 months after the law gets passed to actually provide a list of who should be doing this. Until then, you can kind of figure out on your own if you fall under the requirements or not. And even if you don't, the recommendations here should still be valid for any company out there. But if you fall under NIS, and you don't comply, you also get a fine. Nowadays, you don't. It's just, yeah, I know we should be doing that, but I don't know, I'm a bagel company. Why should I care about security, right? So the requirements for organizations are the following. One, it's necessary and important for management to be aware and understand the requirements of the directive, which is not the case right now. So I've taken a look at some surveys that have been done across the EU, and most of them show that around 80% of companies don't even know that they will fall under NIS2. So they have no clue that this will apply to them come October, right? So one, there's a need for the awareness of like understanding that you need to comply to this, and you need to understand what you need to do to be able to comply to this. And ideally, you shouldn't be starting on October 16th, right? Then reporting. Understanding that you need to have an established process on whenever you detect an incident, how do you report it, who do you report it to, what do you report and when, who's going to handle that communication, and so on and so forth. So making sure that you've got that process in place and that you understand it, you understand how it works so that you're ready once you're required to do so. The risk management side, understanding those measures, which are, I think, on the very next slide, and then ensuring business continuity. That's also part of the requirements. And this includes, for example, system recovery, emergency procedures, having a crisis response team, and so on and so forth. So what are those risk management requirements? Because I've mentioned we're going to take a look at the list. There's basically 10 of them, and they're mentioned under Article 21 of the directive. And you can see it's just like, it's basics around cybersecurity. It's not rocket science, not reinventing the wheel or anything. There's a lot of measures in place, both technical, there's SOPs, there's stuff that you can do and you could have done for years along any of these 10 points. Now you have to do them, and you have to be able to prove that you've done them, right? So you're looking at using MFA, right? Having a cybersecurity strategy and doing governance, having an incident handling policy, doing risk management, ensuring your supply chain security, knowing where you get your data, products, services from, and whether that's handled in a secure manner. Training, awareness for your staff, and so on. Doing asset management and access control, crisis management, handling cryptography and encryption properly, and having that business continuity and disaster recovery in place. So it's not, they don't tell you how to do it or try to sell you a certain product or a service, but you're supposed to find a way to implement those things. And again, it's not something that's new. It's something that's been there for a while. You just have to do it now. So that's kind of the difference. And yes, here's some examples of stuff that you could be looking at. So you can definitely see that this is not something that you can do overnight, right? So you need to start yesterday, if possible. If you're not doing any of these or most of these, like protecting your assets, your data, applications, endpoints, network, perimeter, and the human layer, doing compliance and governance, doing stuff around disaster recovery, DevOps, backup and restore, and so on and so forth. So all of these things are out there and have been out there for years. It's just a matter of starting to use them. And right now, this does apply to those essential and important business sectors. So if you fall under that, this is an example of what you should be doing. When it comes to reporting incidents, and again, you can find that in Articles 6 and 23. For one, there's a definition in the directive as to what constitutes a significant security incident, which is a serious or a possibly serious disruption of services or financial losses that affects usually a lot of people, right? So it's kind of similar to GDPR and PII being, I don't know, compromised in some way. Any sort of disruption that might cause problems for the general population will fall under that title of significant security incident, which is other natural legal persons that might have been or might be affected adversely by what's called substantial material or immaterial damage. So there's no clear guideline as to what that means. You might err on the side of caution and report more than what you should, or maybe you don't know the impact and you need the help of the local authorities to help you determine that, right? But the thing is, if it has the potential of impacting a lot of people, you need to consider reporting it. And I've already mentioned the reporting deadline, so it's an early warning within 24 hours of having discovered that, not within 24 hours of having been hacked. Now, the average industry level as to how long it takes since you've been hacked up until you discover that varies by vertical, varies by sector, but it's on average between 6 to 9 months. Months. That's the average. So imagine if today you find out that you've been hacked in July of last year. Now, within this time, what could the bad guys have done? Right? They could have obviously copied all the data 100 times over. But more importantly, if you're a hacker and you're really good at what you do, usually you get in, you do what you want, you do what you need, and you get out and nobody knows that you've even been there, right? Or you try to leave as little of an impact or a visible impact as possible. So think of all the potential changes that could be done to critical infrastructure, critical databases, without the knowledge of the people and organizations managing those databases or that infrastructure, because you don't even know you've been hacked, right? So trying to go with that zero trust, assume breach approach that was discussed yesterday is mandatory here. So once you know you've been hacked or you're the target of such an incident, you've got 24 hours to do an early warning to report that. Within 72 hours, you're supposed to give an update on that early warning and provide an initial assessment of the security incident. Anytime upon request, you should be able to provide relevant status update, and after 1 month, you're expected to provide either a final report or an intermediary report until that final report comes in with more details, like a detailed description, doing a root cause analysis, what sort of mitigations you've put in place, any potential cross-border impact that you might foresee, and so on and so forth. Fines. So what happens if you don't comply? Now, authorities with NIS2 are given broader inspection powers. And there's a lot of concern that this might be abused as well. Because now you can have the local authority just come willy-nilly on an on-site inspection, and you're supposed to comply with that. And they can ask for security audits or give instructions or orders, and you need to be able to prove that you've complied with that. Now, essential entities, if you're found to be non-compliant, you can get fined up to 10 million euros of up to 2% of the total worldwide annual turnover. Management accountability is here. So I've already mentioned the potential discharge of C-suite managerial functions. And the suspension of the certifications or authorizations that are required for you or your organization to function, to provide its services. Important entities have it slightly better. It only goes up to 7 million or 1.4% of the total turnover, whichever is highest. So what would be the next step with this, right? One is to try and determine if your business is or will be impacted by NIS2. Even if it's not impacted by NIS1, you should take a look at what the requirements are. I've already mentioned some of them in my slides, but they're also in the text of the directive. Raising awareness with senior management, because if senior management has no clue about it, there's not going to be any decision at the organization level to actually do something about it until it's probably too late. Estimating any expenses or budget that's required to get on the road to compliance or become compliant. Review those 10 risk management measures that are required of you, assessing your supply chain, trying to simplify incident reporting or implementing incident reporting if you don't already have that as an internal procedure, developing your business continuity and crisis management plans, implementing an ISMS as per the NIS2 criteria. Now, there's a bullet point that I wanted to include here. If your organization is already compliant with ISO 27001, that already covers about 70% of the NIS2 requirements. So you're already in a better position, better starting position to just do the remaining stuff. Or if you're not sure what you should be doing right now, because the member states have not put any laws or guidelines into what you should implement, just look at ISO 27001 and start doing that. And by the time the member states put out more recommendations, you'll already be well off on the way to becoming compliant. So just look at ISO 27001 for that. And also ensuring secure development practices. Now, what I'm expecting that will happen in reality is, and this is a quote that I like from Jim Butcher, if you know the author, you don't have to run faster than the bear to get away, you just have to run faster than the guy next to you, right? So a lot of companies will still do the bare minimum to just not be the last one, to not be in a worse off position than the other guy. Let the others get the fines. Let the others be attacked or be the low-hanging fruits that the hackers will go for because they're easy to hack, right? So just do the bare minimum, and that's going to be enough. And for, unfortunately, a lot of companies, that's still going to be the modus operandi, like it is with the current NIS1 directive. But even so, the awareness that NIS2 does bring along should help kickstart a movement towards better security inside organizations, especially organizations that fall under the NIS2 umbrella. Now, the second thing that I wanted to talk about today, and it's somewhat related, and that's still a bit lagging behind, is the Cyber Resilience Act. Who here is familiar with the CRA? That's like 5 people. Okay, so you're still in the right room, and that's great. So the idea and the premise behind the CRA, I think, can be summed up really nicely in this quote by Ursula von der Leyen. If everything is connected, everything can be hacked. Given that resources are scarce, we have to bundle our forces. This is why we need a European cyber defense policy, including legislation setting common standards under a new European Cyber Resilience Act. So what is the CRA? It's regulation on a broad scale that will apply, and I say will because it hasn't fully come into effect, will apply to all products with digital elements. This means that this will cover anything that has a direct or indirect logical or physical data connection to a device or a network. So any piece of software or hardware that connects to something else falls under CRA. And the CRA also introduces another idea, another concept of so-called critical products with digital elements. And those might be based, so the criteria of how you fall under the critical products, it's either based on functionality, it could be critical software, the intended use, if it's something that's being used, whether hardware or software, for industrial control systems, or just falls under NIS2, that we've already talked about, and other criteria by the potential extent of the impact that it might have if that device, software, whatever, gets compromised. And that in itself is further divided into 2 risk classes, and they have a special conformity procedure. We'll see what that means in a minute. It's actually the next slide. So the purpose that the CRA goes for is to ensure that the products with digital elements have fewer vulnerabilities and that the manufacturers remain responsible for the cybersecurity of those products throughout the entire life cycle. So what this means is that your smart fridge should be receiving updates for as long as it is on the market, not for like 2 years and then that's it because a new model has shown up on the market. Which is something that a lot of companies will have a lot of struggles to deal with, right? Improving transparency of the security of hardware and software products, and providing better protections for business users and consumers. There's a fact sheet on the EU website for that. Now, what sort of products are affected? And the default category, that will cover about 90% of stuff, right? And you will only be required to provide a self-assessment saying that, hey, I've done my best to comply with the CRA to do security right, whether it's a software or hardware product. And this goes for smart speakers, toys, domestic robots, hard drives, word processors, any piece of software or hardware out there, any sort of IoT device that you might get at home, your smart lights, your whatever, right? So for this, you'll only be required to do that self-assessment. If you fall, however, if you fall under the critical products category, that's, again, divided into two. Class 1, the critical products, they require either a self-assessment, but that usually means the application of a standard for that self-assessment, or having a third party do the assessment that, hey, you're doing a good job protecting that piece of software or hardware. And this is where ISMSs fall under browsers, password managers, antivirus software, CM systems, routers, microcontrollers, and the like. And then you've got the other class, the class 2, the highly critical products. This is mandatory to have a third-party assessment, so you can't just go out there and say, I promise I've been doing a good job on security on these things. You need to be audited by a third party to validate that. This is where operating systems and hardware security modules, industrial firewalls, CPUs, and so on will fall under. So what does this actually mean? One, there's a number of addressees that this CRA applies to. For one, if you're a manufacturer, so you are a natural legal person who develops or manufactures digital products, or who has those digital products designed, developed, or manufactures and distributes them under their trademark. So even if you don't develop it yourself, but you pay someone to develop something for you, but then you put it out there on the market, you are affected by this. You need to abide to the CRA. If you're an importer, so anyone who places on the EU market any sort of hardware or software product, you need to ensure that the product complies with the CRA. So you can't bring it, just like right now you're doing imports with food and whatnot, and it has to be compliant with certain regulations, it's going to be the same with digital products. So even if the product is not made in the EU, and you're providing that to citizens or companies within the EU, you will have to buy that, and anyone who resells that or refuses to sell that, it's just like with the GDPR. It doesn't just apply to the EU. It applies to the likes of Facebook and whatnot, right? They have to abide, and they get fines otherwise, which they did. And then distributors. So anyone in the supply chain that makes a product with digital elements available without affecting its properties, they still need to fall under this CRA, and they still need to ensure that the product itself abides to the CRA. So the main requirements are, one, to assess the cyber risks before you launch the product on the market. Again, software or hardware, doesn't matter. You need to monitor those products for their entire life cycle and provide free security updates. This is the biggest thing, I think, here. Free security updates for the entire life cycle of the product or service. You have reporting obligations, just like with NIS2, in case of security incidents, and you need to be able to provide extensive documentation as to who the owner of that product is, who manufactured, produced it, kind of put it together if it's a hardware thing. And you are required to only place products that are in conformity with the CRA on the market. And additional information requirements might be required, especially contact information. So that's part of the documentation side. So who do I contact in case my smart fridge starts sending out spam, right? And in case of non-compliance, that product or service will be withdrawn or recalled from the market. So that's the risk that you're facing, which is gonna be tough. It's also gonna be tough to implement, don't get me wrong. Now, it also comes with sanctions and fines. So the sanctions here go up to 15 million euros or up to 2.5 of the turnover. Because you know, it's a product company, they must have money because they're doing that on a large scale. And this is also interesting, but it's also one of those things that has the potential for abuse. They haven't yet excluded multiple fines for the same infringement. Because right now, if you're found to be uncompliant, you get a fine for that, you pay it, and that's it. You promise you're going to try better next time. But with this, if you're found to be uncompliant, you get a fine. And then a while later, if you're still found to be uncompliant, you get another fine, and another fine, and another fine. And with the amount that it can go up to, that can easily take a business out of business, right? Now, the roadmap here, this was announced back in 2021, September of 2021. It came in as a proposal in September of 2022, and it entered the trilogue, the dialogue between the three parties of the EU, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, in August of last year. It's expected to go into effect, to be adopted, somewhere either this year or next year. A lot of the specialists out there expected it will be sooner rather than later, so it might actually come into effect this year. And member states will have a certain amount of time to implement it and so on and so forth. So it's not something that's going to be overnight, but it's there. It's already been, it entered the trilogue, it's past the proposal stage, and it just needs to be adopted soon, right? So when it comes to preparing for that, there's already, just like with NIS2, there's already a set of compliance solutions or things that you could do as best practices, right, to be prepared. And in the case of the CRA, there's some basic things that you can already do, like check if you're affected, look at the legislations, the norms, the standards, guidelines, and so on and so forth. Derive specifications out of that, like what sort of technology implementations I need to put into place. How do I change the flow and the processes within my organization to be able to handle that? Implementing risk assessment and risk management and corrective measures, documenting everything and so on and so forth, and then monitoring for all the requirements of the CRA. So you can already kind of get things started if you know you might be affected by this. And why should you do it now? Well, the sooner you start with any of these two, the better. Like, you will save costs, because all the stuff that I've already mentioned, even though it's been out there for a while, it still takes time to implement. And it's not just time, it's also budget, costs. Like, you need the resources, you need the people, you need the know-how. You need to find someone who can help you with that. And by the time you get close to any deadlines, anyone who's able to help you with that is probably going to be helping somebody else, and they're going to be busy. So you need to plan ahead if you don't have someone internally in your organizations who's able to do that now. Avoiding the potential penalties, getting that peace of mind, and contributing to national security and whatnot, that's also part of it. Now, as a bonus here, there's this link to a fact sheet, and it's really, really cool. This was published back in November of last year, and it's kind of an overview of what's going on with the EU legislation, which is both in terms of the laws and directives that are in effect or are supposed to be coming soon into effect in the digital sector, and any enforcement mechanisms and agencies for each of those verticals. And they also have kind of an overview of what went through in recent years. So the top file presented in 2020, this is where the NIS2 Directive was presented. It came into effect last year, and there were a bunch of others. 2021, this made the news in December, the AI Act. Maybe you've heard of that, with the EU putting out an AI Act, making a bit more clear as to what entails a proper security, the proper security of AI and protecting yourself against Skynet, right, essentially. So that was discussed in 2021, and December of last year is when it was published, and you can find out more about that. There's links to all of these in the document. The CRA was back in 2022, so that's why you see it's kind of a 1.5 to 2 years gap between the NIS2 and the CRA. So it's going to take a bit longer for the CRA to actually come into effect, but it's coming. And it's one of the many, right? And there's a bunch of others that were there in 2023. So I highly recommend you take a look at that link. And with that, there's still a few minutes for questions, but that concludes my talk for today. All right, questions? Yes?
For the CRA, for example, do you have an idea how would that control me buying a router from AliExpress and being shipped to me with open entity port? Who should control that?
So one, if AliExpress is delivering products to the EU, they're going to be the ones that should be responsible to ensure that the products are in conformity. And whenever they get imported into the EU, they abide to the CRA. Yes, they should. Yes. Just like today, there's probably going to be ways to circumvent that. And people and companies are going to get really creative at that. But this is, I think, a move in the right direction in trying to ensure that you don't get a phone that only gets security updates for 2 years and then you have to buy a new one, things of that nature. Now, some manufacturers, providers out there have already started to do this, but it's a long road to get there. Yes, question here.
So, as you said, the ISO 27K1 covers most of the NIS2.
Yeah.
But now that we think of how, for example, an ISO 27K1 audit goes, it's like you're pretty good if you can just provide a glossary of your ISMS, and most likely the auditor won't even care about looking at what you have inside. How do you think the NIS2 audits will be done? Is it going to be this, for some reason people love advertising that, yeah, we passed ISO 27K1, but no one says like, yeah, and? What is that?
Okay.
You made a glossary.
That's a very good point, and I'm expecting things to probably work in a similar fashion like they do in the industry right now. Now, coming from the other side of the story, so what we actually do is we don't do audits for ISO, but we help companies implement the ISO requirements and focusing on the ones that make sense for the company. Because in some cases, it's enough if you provide the documentation and you say, like, we're compliant and that's it. But doing what the ISO requires of you will help you in the long run. And that's what, personally, I've been trying to make our customers understand. And it's going to be a huge difference into how it gets actually implemented and how you get to prove that. So that's a given. It's, again, just like with the CRA, I think it's a step in the right direction. But it's going to take us a lot longer to get there. That's correct. Yes?
How do I know if I'm in an essential supply chain?
Okay.
How do I get to know that?
So the Annex 1 and 2 of the directive give you a lot more details as to what the criteria are and how you fall under that. And if that's still fuzzy, each member state is required to provide a list of those providers within, I think, 6 months of the directive coming into effect as national law.
But it's a recursive problem because it's supply chain.
Yeah.
So you have an energy company, which is essential, which buys their parts from another company. Well, they can perhaps look at the national list, see, hey, this energy company is on there. But then this company isn't on that list.
But you say the supply chain.
I am 3 layers behind that.
You will, like, the best thing you could do is to just go with the safe route and just do those things. Because if you're not doing them already, you're doing a poor job at kind of handling security anyway. So there's no downside, there's no real downside into starting to implement those requirements, even if you don't today fall under the requirements of NIS2, because a year from now, you might come under the supply chain of such an organization, and then you will have to anyway, and they will ask of you. Like when you sign with them, they'll tell, but are you compliant with this and this and that? And you're gonna say, no, because I figured I'm not on the list, so I don't have to do anything. So you might be losing business because of that. That makes sense.
So you see the same thing like right now, that they only choose companies that are ISO 27001.
This is something, it's one of those things that will be left to the member states to decide how they actually implement that. So it might vary from country to country. There was a question right at the back.
How does this all apply to open source? Because I guess there was an outrage from the open source community about these directives. Like, are they suppliers or not?
That is a very good question, and I don't think there's a clear answer on that from the EU or the member states. So it's still, in a lot of areas, this is still fuzzy, right? And who's going to kind of provide support for something that is open source, right? Maybe it'll be a shared responsibility. Maybe it'll fall under the organization that, hey, I want to use open source, but now I become responsible for whatever I put in to my company code or whatever. But it's still fuzzy, and there's no like clear guideline on that yet. Yes. Ideally, it should be up to the vendor, but then if you say that it's end of life, you need to be able to handle that properly. Because, again, there's room for abuse. I'm going to sell you a smartwatch. End of life 3 months from now. You decide if you buy it or not, right? Because after 3 months, I will not be providing free security updates for it. So it's, again, this is also a long discussion, and with the CRA, we're still like 2-3 years from actually having something to work with that's more concrete. There's a lot of discussions and debates around that. It's a very good question. I do not know if there's some kind of clear guideline on that yet, so I couldn't tell you. But as far as I know, that's still part of the same fuzziness that revolves around these things. Yes?
So it seems like a lot of NIS2 is risk management.
Yeah. Can you repeat that? So there's some overlap, and as luck would have it, a lot of these things like ISO and NIS2 and DORA and whatever, they all go towards the same goal, doing security better. And if you do certain things, so like if you start implementing ISO 27001, you'll probably cover some of the DORA requirements, you'll cover some of the NIS2 requirements, and so on and so forth. It's still risk management, it's still best practices. Now it comes with a clearer list. 1, 2, it comes with sanctions that are imposed and not like left to the member states to decide, but it's not something fundamentally different. It's just doing security better or right. Another question? There was at the... Oh, so it was answered. Okay. There, at the back.
With the NIS2 Act, you had a timer on the screen?
Yes.
That's when the member states have to implement?
Yes, that's correct.
Is there also a period where the regulation goes into effect? Like, is there like a few months or a year or some period before it actually goes into effect?
All right, so the question was, the timer, is that the timeline until the member states have to implement this into law? and when it goes into effect. So it's already in effect from January of last year, but until the member states pass it as national law, there's nothing to actually ask you to do or mandate you to do anything. That's the October deadline. This is when all member states should have a national law passed. So when you have a national law, you're already supposed to be doing what the law requires. Now, with NIS1, there were, in a lot of countries, there were a few weeks or months of delay until the national law was passed, and then guidelines on how to implement that, and then lists, and then whatever. So it's not going to be October 18th when the fines start to come in, because nobody will still know clearly what it is they're supposed to be doing. The more you do until then, and the requirements are vague enough for you to be able to start working on stuff, the better position you'll be in. But by the time nation states put that into national law, it will be in effect, and you will have to do those things. All right, any other questions? If not, thank you again for your time and attention, and hopefully you found out a little bit more about NIS and CRA today. Right, thanks.